To be absolutely honest, I had to personally look up some information about the Suzuki Foundation. I'm sure many of you in the room are more aware of it than I. And I found a really interesting story behind it. It is named after a fisherman of Japanese ancestry who, like many similar fishermen, particularly in Canada, had his life interrupted by the Second World War and the internment that was faced by Japanese fishermen and their loss of income. As many in the room may know, a lot of those people, after the war ended, tried to reestablish their lives in the fishing community, particularly in British Columbia. And what's interesting is the namesake, Tsutsuro Buck Suzuki, went one step further. He actually worked hard to enshrine the rights of Japanese fishermen to work as equals in the industry through the Fishermen's Union. And then once that was done, he went further and became one of the pioneering sort of ocean and fisheries conservationists on the coast, fighting for protection of habitat, fighting against things like wholesale industrial pollution into the waterways that all affected the populations. The foundation was founded in 1981 in his name, and it is designed to work with both the fishing industry and the environmental side to come up with joint solutions. And Emily Orr is the executive director of the foundation, and her background is kind of mimics the history of the foundation. She comes from a fishing family. Second generation, she's done her time, both as a deckhand, as a captain of the fishing industry, and then she moved her efforts towards more conservation and management issues. And she's going to speak today about some aspects of her work. So welcome to the IOF, Emily.
Thank you so much, Dave, for the warm welcome and the introduction. It's really a privilege to be here. I'm really excited to have this time with all of you and talk about what is clearly something very near and dear to my heart, and really what drives the work that I do and have done for more than 25 years now. As was introduced, I have a commercial fishing background. I started out fishing with my dad when I was about 19 years old, and this doesn't maybe move it. I'm not sure how to, now that it's under different control. Move my slide. Thank you. This way? Yeah, great. Thank you. So I started out fishing when I was about 19. My parents kind of resisted that idea. They knew that this was a pretty tough way of life, with a lot of uncertainty attached to it, but I was really bent on doing it. I remembered being a young kid and my dad would let me help pour lead for weights in the garage of our family home, and just being fascinated by the fact that just ropes held the boats to the dock. And so so much tactile memory for me that drove that passion that I really wanted to be a part of that life. And that's really, it's what it is. It's not really a job, it's a way of life. When you fish, you are all in. There is no 9 to 5. There's no structure that you can really count on, because when you're fishing, you need to put that day of work in until the day is done. And sometimes that means you're still boxing prawns on the boat at the dock at 2 or 3 in the morning, whatever it takes, because you don't have the option to just leave it there and come back tomorrow. That's not going to work. So you end up in a life where you are really, you're so dedicated and held to what it is, like the weather and what the buyer needs, and where you need to fish and where you need to be to make sure that you can supply this seafood, which lots of times that's forgotten, is this is a food source to the domestic and the foreign markets. So there's a million different directions that I can go in to talk about sort of the harvester perspective, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of my beginnings in the fishing industry and what that meant to me. I fished with my dad for many, many years. I fished with other families. I fished on other boats. And I'll tell you, it's a bit more, deckhanding is harder work. But the pressure is a lot greater, obviously, as a captain. You start taking the headphones off. You can see in the younger picture, I used to listen to a lot of Led Zeppelin on the boat. But when you're in charge and you're skippering, you need to be listening to the engine. You need to be listening and making sure that your crew is safe. You're watching, if you're keeping up with the gear, and it's a lot of pressure and it's a lot of fun. So I miss it. So that's a little bit about me and where I started out. When I started having a family, that's when I moved off the boat and onto land. So I fished until I was almost 30. So now I've been strictly working on land, doing advocacy and representation, and I've done that in a variety of capacities. And currently with this role, it's really a privilege to work under the name of TBAC Suzuki. And so many of the values of the TBAC Foundation align with my feelings and my experience. So it's really a beautiful thing when you can work in a way that aligns with your personal values. So I want to talk a bit about the integrated approach. This was something that was flagged for me that would be really valuable to talk about in this room, is bringing the harvester perspective into marine planning, into the fisheries landscape of what it takes to manage fisheries and what's involved in that. And so we could spend ages on any one of these topics, but I'd love to just highlight a few sort of initial concepts that come to mind from a harvester perspective when I think about these themes. So ethics, we can all agree that there's certainly some core values that we would all share about sustainability and access and how we manage our resources. It's not that simple. We often run into some issues with stakeholders about allocation. And so ethics comes into play in a really big way about how we share resources. And then the science and the politics really are intertwined into that. So when we think about ethics in fisheries, there's some big questions right now that some of you are probably going to be thinking a lot about as you move forward in your careers. Who has the first crack at the fish? We know about FSC and First Nations rights and priorities, recreational fishing and where that fits in with commercial access. There's a lot of debate about the ethics of access. So that's a big theme for harvesters when we talk about seeing the integrated approach through our lens. Food security. I mentioned earlier, often fishing is not necessarily directly thought about in the theme of food security, but it's a big one. It's a renewable, sustainable resource of food and wild, healthy food. So it's something that we need to think about more in terms of protecting the viability of fishing. Not just the sustainability, that's a given, but how can we make sure that fisheries stay viable so that harvesters can keep doing the work of bringing that sustainable food source back home? Fisheries economics, massive. But from the lens of a personal view, from a harvester, there's a lot of different aspects of the fisheries economy that we are very concerned with. Fish harvesters are price takers, not price makers. So foreign markets play a huge role in what the landed value is to the fish harvester, but so does things like leasing arrangements and who owns the access. And one of the pieces that TBAC and the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union, which created TBAC in 1981, one of our huge themes right now of focus is on license policy reform. And a big component of that is the fisheries economics. Some harvesters are going out and leasing licenses at a cost so high that they end up going backwards. And so there are investors who get their pay upfront, and then depending on what the price does, what the markets do, and you still have to pay your crew, hopefully, and then if you are paying your fuel bill and your bait and the cost of licenses and monitoring to go out, there are many harvesters who are so close to going in the red or are in the red. And so this is something that needs to be part of the conversation when we look at fisheries and fisheries economics as a whole. So politics, policy development, fisheries management, and who's at the wheel. This is really interesting. I spend a lot of time in meetings. I spend a lot of time lobbying the federal government, the provincial government. I spend a lot of time in rooms trying to help people understand how we need management decisions made. There are cases, and of course, in a perfect world, science would inform management, and we would respect that. I mean, one piece that's important for you to know is harvesters really respect science as a role in management. We actually want that more, because unfortunately what we see a lot of the time is politics becoming the leading hand in how fisheries are managed. And often there's a lot of misinformation that feeds into those political decisions. So Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, for example, over 60% of the salmon fishery runs were closed on no notice. Even the fisheries managers on the ground had no warning of that. That's a really big red flag. The fisheries managers themselves should be part of those decisions. They need to be coming from the ground up, not the top down. So who's at the wheel is really important. And as a harvester and a representative of harvesters, what I can do is bring that perspective into Ottawa, into 200 Kent Street, and say, hey, these guys had just fueled their boats, put food on, brought their deckhands up, and were closed down with no notice. This is a problem. Also for the province, who's going to have the fallback on what's going to happen economically for those people. But so many of those runs, there was no justification to close them. And unfortunately, the optics are salmon are in trouble, salmon need help. That's true in many cases. It's not necessarily true across the board. And so having that information from science really be what leads the management hand is so important. So that's something that I say a lot when I'm meeting with policymakers and decision makers. So stakeholders and what's at stake. As you might imagine, I've already kind of hinted at how important the economics are for fish harvesters, but that comes through in the management decisions, the policy decisions. The stakeholders who I represent when I go into meetings are generally the commercial harvest, the First Nations, the rec fishers, but also other marine users. I don't focus so much on the shipping aspect or the rec tourism aspect. I'm aware, but I don't zero in so much on that. It's more about who gets to fish and when, and what that access looks like when we go to the decision place. So there's a lot at stake. The Northern Shelf Marine Protected Area that's about to be implemented, that's 2/3 of BC's coast, and of what will be closed in that marine protected area, some harvesters will lose 100% of their access, depending where they fish and how they fish. So they have to go somewhere. They're going to condense effort into other areas, which is going to put more pressure on other areas. Our MPA is really the solution. You know, we have really rigorously managed fisheries. The idea of MPAs kind of speaks to or hints at the idea that our management system doesn't work. And I would disagree with that, but MPAs is a different topic. Fish harvesters are not ever going to say they don't believe in conservation and sustainability. That's really important to them. But there are some pieces that deserve much more contemplation and more time and more thoughtful evaluation about what the implications are for those stakeholders. So that's just a bit of a little bit of a highlight reel for some of the thoughts that come to mind when I think about these themes from this perspective. But later, I really invite some questions if there's anything in particular that makes you curious about some of those pieces. So the harvester's role in marine planning processes. But first, the trouble with bad optics. So fish harvesters get a bad rap, and in the public, the thinking often is that fishermen are greedy and they're out there just kind of pillaging and taking everything they can, and it's something to tamper down or to interfere with. And that just couldn't be so much further from the truth, because fish harvesters, of course, rely on fisheries to earn their livelihoods. So no one cares more about sustainability and viability and ensuring that ecosystems are healthy than harvesters who rely on it. So in my experience, I can tell you, back when I first started becoming involved, it was at the prawn advisory table. And at that time, my father was a real fierce advocate for the prawn fishery. And some of the things that he was advocating for were effort controls in that fishery. So trap production, trap limits, single haul. You used to be able to fish thousands of traps and haul them twice a day, and people would fish all night long around the clock, and this was not sustainable. It was the fish harvesters themselves, the ones that were thinking a long term, saying, no, this is not how we're gonna see fisheries work into the future. We need to make sure to bring in minimum size limits. We need trap limits. We need these effort controls. So what you'll see, if you look into some of the history of management practices, often it's the harvesters that are calling for those actions. And unfortunately, the public doesn't often get to hear or know that. So it's an important piece, I think, for you. So stewards of the marine resources, I mean, that's kind of what that is. I mean, fish harvesters are so concerned with their long-term viability and the resource that they rely on. There's a deep respect there. So that's something that can be leveraged, I think, from the science community and management community. That relationship is really important because you can tap into harvesters and their desire and their passion to make sure that this resource is well managed. And often we find ourselves in debates with management and not seeing eye to eye. So making that relationship work more cohesively and respectfully is a really, really important piece that I'm constantly trying to thread into the work that I do. And then that value and experience. I mean, you can study a species of fish for years and you can think about it and you can understand its biology. But when you're handling it every day for decades, for example, and you're seeing the trends firsthand and you're understanding in a more environmentally present way what's happening with a species or what's happening with that particular environment, those things, the canary in the coal mine idea, become really important. Like when I used to fish, I could see that the prawns, for example, in Saanich Inlet were way smaller than the ones a little further north in Stewart Channel. I don't think that was anything probably new to science, but being able to see firsthand how the prawns in Stewart Channel, the size was just getting smaller and smaller so quickly in terms of average. Being able to flag that and say, you know, look, we used to catch prawns predominantly 80% were jumbos or XL, and now we're down to like 40% that are above a large. Those kind of anecdotal pieces of information become really important for DFO science to be able to say, okay, we better take a look at what's happening here, refer to the spawner index, look at the effort, see if these things are connecting in a way that makes sense in a sustainable way. So that's really important, having that interaction. So the socioeconomic impacts of changes to access, policy, and management, nobody's going to be able to frame that better for you than the people that are experiencing it on the ground. So thinking about, for example, not having an owner-operator policy, whereas they do have it on the East Coast, we can do some comparative work. We can talk to fish harvesters and we can see what their cost of doing business is and how policy impacts that. Like Canada does not have any mechanism in place to stop foreign ownership of Pacific region licenses and quotas, for example. How does that impact the socioeconomics of harvesters in BC who are getting pushed out and can't afford to buy the license anymore? So those artificial inflations of the values based on investments from overseas, from people that will never set foot on the boat, these are pieces that are really important. And so from the fish harvester lens, I really encourage a lot of thinking around that, because some of you will be doing work that is really pertinent to this kind of conversation about what's the ethical way to manage this resource. And that question kind of comes through in all of these pieces. So how do we bring the harvester perspective into planning processes? As you might imagine, we hold a lot of meetings. We talk with our fish harvesters. We do surveys. We ask people things like, you know, what works for you? What are your issues? What are you seeing? Where are you stumbling? We worked on an MPA survey and the impacts of MPAs to get directly from harvesters their take on how this is going to impact them. And it's shocking to really pick that up and understand what the implications really look like on the ground. And I think sometimes that gets forgotten. If you're not there, you're not connected to that hands-on experience, it's sometimes easy to forget what that looks like in real life. So acting as a conduit in consultation and engagement. I mean, fish harvesters are busy fishing a lot of the time. So people like me need to go and be there on their behalf. And what I can tell you, which is frustrating for me sometimes, is there are oftentimes rooms where I'm the only person in that room at that table who has fishing experience. And we're making decisions and we're talking about, or we're lobbying for change that impacts harvesters, but they can't be at that table because they're busy fishing. And this doesn't pay them. I mean, the government, you want to go and lobby in Ottawa, there's not a reimbursement from the federal government for that. But we try to do that. We try to make sure that those resources are there to bring harvesters into those rooms in Ottawa and to bring harvesters to the table and make it so that they're not taking a loss by not going fishing that day. So you can see how that's tricky for harvesters themselves to be really active, because to be involved at a level, for example, that I am, it's a full-time job. So it's really important that people like me are talking with harvesters and understand what harvesters are dealing with, worried about, facing. That's really one of the main purposes of what I do. So the meetings that we have, provincially, federally, with like-minded adjacent organizations, these are all really important. And we're seeing movement. I mean, sometimes you can go years or even decades begging for the same thing and not really feeling like you're getting anywhere. And then sometimes you can see that dial move, and you know it's because you've been really persistent and you've knocked on the right doors and you've insisted on the same thing long enough that you're being heard. So sometimes it takes a bit of self-reminder that it does make a big difference, because it takes time, and processes that change policy take years. And so you have to be really dedicated and involved. So our collaborations with like-minded NGOs, that's really pivotal, because it's important that there is a bolder, more unified voice. It can't just be one person, one organization saying a thing. So coordinating those pieces so that you can speak on behalf of harvesters and bring that perspective in a bigger way is so valuable. So that's another big piece of what we do. So how has fishing experience impacted the marine planning processes that we engage in? I will tell you, you have street cred when you go in. If you're going to go and speak with a senator, you're going to go in and speak with the minister's office, that you can say that you have fished, that means something to them, because they can qualify that information one step further. So they see lots of lobbyists. It's another step forward if you are lobbying, but you also have boots on the deck experience. So that is something that's really valuable. This is a group of us in Ottawa last year in May. EcoTrust and Coastal First Nations, the Union, and TBUC. I'm also the business agent for the Union, so I kind of wear two hats sometimes. So we went to Ottawa to really lobby for license reform, so owner-operator policy for BC. That's actually my dad who was the chief that time at Sartlip, and we used to do test fisheries in Saanich Inlet. And without any prodding or push to do so, my dad used to go to the reservation dock and bring that tote of prawns that we had caught via the test fishery and offer it to the band. And so just those pieces of recognition and partnership and trying to build relationships and bridges instead of be angered by some of the divides that occur in the politics of fisheries really shaped a lot of how I do my work. And this is probably going back 25 years. And then that's me in the Senate, which was such a treat. I mean, I'm not gonna sugarcoat or say that it isn't fun. It's actually a great experience to go and be in these places, saying these things to people that are in a place to make policy change and make decisions. I really enjoy that, and it's really vindicating, because it's brilliant when someone gives you an ear. And so that's also why I'm excited to be here. It's great to be able to speak with you about these things, because I hope that what I can bring to you is that you will think about the harvester perspective as you go forward in your work. So the relationship between the harvest community and the science community is usually a beautiful thing. Then a bit of tongue in cheek. I mean, this is kind of a fun topic. We need to look more at fish harvesters as an opportunistic way of collecting data. They're out there all the time. There's no additional cost usually to harvesters going and bringing in the type of data that some of you may need and want to work with. we're doing that with T-Buck right now. We have a project that's funded by the Tulo Foundation that we're working with Hakai Institute and the Union on. And we are putting what are called PCO2 to go units on vessels opportunistically as they go fishing to collect data for ocean acidification. And so it's a really fascinating and exciting project because there's just such a data void in BC. And ocean acidification, as you rightly know, is certainly a now problem. So being able to leverage this relationship that we have with harvesters and bring them into the science piece of collecting data it's a really sensible and exciting and efficient way to do things. So the mutual beneficial exchange. We know as harvesters that we cannot fish without science. So there's a deep respect for science. We want and appreciate what it is that science does. It enables us to go fishing. We couldn't go fishing without the type of monitoring and management that relies on science. So I just wanted you to hear that from me because maybe you don't get that from harvesters so readily, but it's certainly the truth. So no relationship is perfect. Building trust, this is important. There are processes that ask harvesters for their intimate information about where they fish so that they can compile data on landings, on where fish is coming from. And oftentimes we are asking for that information so that we can go to bat for them and help protect what are some of the more important areas for them to fish in. And there's been cases where that information has been used against them. And the next thing, you know, the fishing areas they cared most about are now off the table because they're more valuable to another sector. So there needs to be a recognition of trust and how important that is because harvesters, there is a trust piece that is always in need of bolstering. The bias awareness is important. It's not, sometimes we have people in positions where they already have some predisposed ideas about what should happen. And some people don't think any fishing should occur. And sometimes those people end up in fishery management positions. And so it's really important to think about what your biases are and how that impacts your work. Because there isn't always a checkpoint for it. And sometimes people's biases really impact the way fisheries are managed. So we hope to make that better. We want to improve that and try to remove the bias out of that. And the same goes for fish harvesters because there are certainly cases where fish harvesters are leery about science. They don't trust what's going to be done with the information. And so they feel very closed off about that. So that's a hurdle that we face a lot. So building that trust relationship by removing biases and helping to remove conflict of interest is really important because you don't want to be giving your data and information to somebody that's going to turn around and use it for their personal gain either. So those are some themes that kind of fit under that little line. And who's paying the bills? A lot of monitoring and a lot of data collection and the process under which we go fishing, the necessity of those things is very cost heavy, and that's downloaded onto the harvester. And so some fisheries, the cost of monitoring has become so excessive that it jeopardizes their ability to go fishing. So thinking about ways that we can help improve that. One of the things T-Buck is doing is building a program to help refine AI that may be able to make some of those monitoring pieces less cost heavy by removing some of the man hours required to review data. And on one hand, you want to promote employment and you don't want to see people losing jobs, but there's that balance of if we can't go fishing because the cost of monitoring has become too high, we need a solution for that. So that's a flag. So looking forward, strengthening the relationship between science and management and harvest community. This is something that I'm really focused on, and I try very hard on a regular basis to build that relationship up and forward. And we have terrific relationships with folks at UBC that we rely on and are so grateful for when we need what we're saying to be backed by science. That's a big piece of the work that I do because I don't have that level of expertise sometimes to say definitively what something is or should be. But but I can get at that via my great relationships with folks here. And at UVic and SFU that lend their expertise to the work that we do. So that's a really harmonious exchange that I think I would love to see really bolstered and grown into something even bigger than it is now. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking and invite you to ask me any questions you have, or even just tell me the work that you intend or the work you're doing now. How do you see what I've been talking about kind of helping shape what it is that you do? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion about things. For those of you in the room, you just have to raise your hand if you have a question or a point you'd like to raise. For those of you online, just type your question into the chat box or raise your hand online and we'll try to get it and read it out. And Emily, for you, I will ask for the benefit of people online, can you just summarize any questions that come from the room so they know, what you're answering? So we'll open it up for discussion. I'll let you.
Please, go ahead.
So much for the great. I was wondering if you could just expand more on like the owner operator policy and I guess like why that hasn't been, or like what the barriers are to like implementing that on the West Coast.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the folks online, the question was, can I expand on the owner operator policy, why it's not been implemented for the Pacific region, what the barriers seem to be? So those are questions that we ask the federal government. So the Atlantic region has had owner operator policy effectively for decades. They brought it into regulation in 2019, I believe, but PIVCAF, which was implemented in 2007 with a 7-year transition period, really laid that groundwork for boots on the deck policy. It doesn't apply to all fisheries, it applies to inshore fisheries. The offshore ones, it's not as applicable because of the scale of economy that those vessels need to operate. But essentially, they're working underneath that policy already and have been for some time. So our question to the government is why would you implement a policy on one coast and not another? Sometimes their answer is that the West Coast has been more focused on conservation. We're not clear how the lack of that policy could be answered by that. I believe that there is such a high level of concentration of ownership by corporations and foreign investors that Canada is very apprehensive about interrupting that. I think it's a more political aspect rather than an ethics question. To me, it's an ethics question. I think that there should be no access of foreign investors to Canadian licenses and quotas. And I believe DFO has an obligation, the Canadian government has an obligation to manage resources for the Canadian people. So it's a bit shocking that there isn't anything to stop that, because in theory, 100% of our licenses and quotas could be owned by foreign interests. So I don't have a great answer for you, but what I can say is the work that we've done has definitely pushed things forward to a point where DFO is consulting now. And there has been an acknowledgement. The Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans supported unanimously in both of their reports, 2019-23. Premier Eby wrote PM Trudeau supporting owner operator, and the Coastal Marine Strategy specifically highlights we moving to owner operator strategy. So we've seen a ton of really important landmark supports in the last couple of years. So I'm hopeful we're going to see change. It's still going to be a while, because once we have a ministerial order on it, which I'm very hopeful that we hear about soon, maybe not this minister, but you never know, she's not going to be in that spot much longer. Maybe she wants to leave a legacy. But once we have that ministerial order, there's going to be probably at least 7 years of transition time. So we're a ways out, but I think we're getting there.
Can you briefly summarize for those who may not be aware how it operates on the East Coast?
Yeah, so
Without getting too many details.
no, I'll try not to rabbit hole it. So on the East Coast, if you own a fishing license, your core license, you need to be on that boat, your boots on that boat doing the fishing. If you're sick, there are exceptions. You can have somebody else run your boat if there's an extenuating circumstance, but the idea is that if you own the license, that the benefits of your work, the benefits of fishing are flowing to you and to your adjacent community. Thanks for the question. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So my work, is a lot about trying to work with fishing communities in the rural south. And although the context is quite different, but, I would say there are different feelings of this in terms of how fishers feel, about fishing. So a lot of our work depends on citizen science or working with fishing communities in terms of data collection, but also designing incentives for behavioral change. Now, in many cases, even for data collection, like the example that was given, collecting data on ocean acidification, whereby the benefits not sometimes immediate or easily accessible, or sometimes are not sustainable as well, where, for example, for these data can be used and then come to bring something positive for the business, not for the long term. How do you, what are your thoughts on designing incentives in terms of working with fishing communities so that it's mutually beneficial, not just in terms of intangibles, but tangible?
That's a great question. So to summarize it, what kind of incentives can we make available for harvesters to bring them into the process of data collection, despite sometimes it being a really long drawn out process and maybe the results or the benefits aren't immediate, right? So one of the things that we are doing in the ocean acidification data program is we've built an honor area in for those harvesters that respects and compensates for their time, that it's additional to them beyond what they're doing for their work as fishing. To me, that's really important. Fish harvesters are often drawn in to contribute and provide input and be consulted with, but they're not often compensated for their time. So I think that that's a great question, and something that I really like to highlight too, is that we need to be cognizant that, you know, we're getting something and we're asking for something. We need to be reciprocal about that. So whenever I'm involved in a project like that, I'm very much a proponent of a very fair honor area for that work. But fish harvesters, beyond the money piece, are genuinely interested, many of them very interested in being a part of what science can do to help make sure that the fisheries are kept going forward in a sustainable and viable way. So they want to be engaged, they want to be part of the solution. So that's a twofold benefit for them. Yes, please, in the back.
Sorry to go back to the question you have already answered, maybe, but what kind of explanation, what kind of justification did they give in discussion with the DFO for the policy of concentrating the issue in the hand of Jim Patterson and a few others? What kind of logic is there? I understand they say this is easier to manage, which is not true, because when you ride tiger, you cannot get off it, right? Because the tiger will then get you. So what kind of logic do they represent? Or did they just say that's the way it is and goes stuff?
Right. So great question, and I agree. So for online folks, what logic is being supplied to defend why corporate concentration has been allowed for ownership? What's DFO's defense on that? So I won't speak for DFO, but I'll give you what I think is my impression of that. I think DFO would consider that unintended consequences. There was maybe a lack of foresight in license policy development earlier on. I don't think DFO was considering the implications of a growing corporate concentration. I don't think that they were necessarily thinking that it was their job to concern themselves with that. In terms of policy, DFO was very much more focused on science and management, and not necessarily whether fishing access became a tradable commodity. And so I think that there was a bit of a disconnect between the potential of what was going to happen without those policies in place and what DFO felt like maybe its jurisdiction was in managing that. But currently, the defense has been for a long time that it's really difficult to quote unquote unscramble the omelet.
Basically, this is a case of you should not assume malevolence with stupidity now.
Oh, I missed it. Can you say that again?
Not assume malevolence when stupidity is not.
Yeah, so, my response to the unscramble the omelet being difficult is that just because, something is being done and it's difficult to reroute it or undo it, doesn't mean that you're off the hook for doing the right thing. There needs to be a point in time where you stop and reevaluate and set a new course and make sure that things are done right, even if it's hard. The right path is often not the easy path. So we're very hopeful that DFO can find ways to approach policy change. We don't want to see people disadvantaged or investors suffer a consequence, but currently fish harvesters themselves are the ones that have been suffering in a very broken system for a long time. So it's the ethics question of, who's going to suffer the pain. And the harvesters, I think, in many cases have had the pain long enough, and it's time to switch the script a little bit. But as I said, I'm seeing a lot of positive trend now toward policy change. It's more a matter of getting that ministerial order, getting that decision in place so that DFO can go to the work of figuring out, okay, how are we going to do this? So.
I think we have one question online.
Yeah, Carl Walters has his hand up, so he can.
Oh,
ask him to-
Carl, I don't know if you can just go ahead and speak.
Oh, I guess so, yeah, Emily,
Oh,
I don't know whether you've followed any of the horror show that's gone on with the shrimp trawlers. Billy Christensen and I have been working with Jim McIsaac, who just retired from T-Buck Suzuki, to try to do the things you're talking about today, to try to deal with a huge American foreign ownership problem with a big part of the fleet, with DFO's reluctance to use information gathered by fishermen and to cooperate in the development of collaborative trawl surveys. And they're implementing a really crazy weakest stock policy where they're shutting down fisheries in the Georgia Strait because they think one of the mixed species of shrimp that are taken together is in trouble. It's not, but they're not doing proper stock assessment to figure out what's going on. And every time we talk to them, their answer is always to put things off to another CSAS, scientific review thing. Have you followed any of that? And what do you think about what's going on in that crazy situation, if you have?
okay. So now you know what the online people, when they can't hear your questions. So we're gonna try to summarize Carl's question for those of you in the room.
Yeah, hi Carl, great to hear from you. So the question from Carl is centered around the shrimp fishery in Georgia Strait and how Carl and Billy Christensen have been working with the previous AD for T-Buck, Jim McIsaac, to help bring some attention to the fact that that fishery is so underutilized because the stock assessment is quite weak, and I would say not being done in a really robust or fair way. And Carl's asking if I've been following along and sort of being frustrated too by DFO's response to shove that off onto more CSAS processes. So Carl, yes, I have been following along. I was at the shrimp sectorial in the fall, and it's really disheartening and it's really frustrating to see that there is a fishery opportunity in BC that is so underutilized, and yet the blockade seems to be that we just can't get the science together to support a proper fishery. And so I spent some time with Phil Burgess, who is a very strong voice in that work, who is one of the shrimp fishermen, and he spends a lot of time trying to educate DFO science about how shrimp fishing needs to be done in the testing work to emulate the actual shrimp fishery as it occurs. Because what is the case is when DFO is going to do their test fishery, for example, they're not setting the doors at the right span, they're not dragging at the right depth, they're not doing the things that fish harvesters themselves do and catch a great deal of shrimp by doing. So when DFO goes to do the fishing work, they might be coming up pretty short, but it's because they're not really fishing in the way that they should be. So there's a lot of frustration around that. Carl, I just agree with you, so I'm not sure if I can speak to it any better than your question already does. It's really a frustration. And it's one that we're really trying to work to get DFO to come around with us on.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was a great answer. You are familiar and you are following it and you are trying to do something. And Billy and I are just about giving up.
Don't give up. So he was thanking me for being aware and for the work that I'm still pursuing alongside that, and saying that he and Billy are about ready to give up. Please don't give up. It's to be really, really clear, it's your, Carl, your and Billy's input to that really validates what it is that fish harvesters are trying to say. And sometimes fish harvesters don't get the credit because they're not perhaps formally educated and they don't have the qualifications behind their name to defend what it is that they're saying. So DFO does qualify science. So please don't give up. Happy to chat with you on that later.
Sorry, I saw it's not too loud. So you mentioned about involving the fishing communities in doing some of the monitoring, such as ocean locations that reduce to climate change. I'm just interested to know what's the actions now that are being taken or being thinking about in terms of adapting to climate change for the fishing community.
Can you say the last part? What's being attempted?
Like, what are the adaptation actions that are being undertaken to impact climate change, which that are being undertaken by fishing communities or organizations?
Okay, great question. So it's about climate change and what are the adaptations that harvesters or committees are looking at taking to help mitigate the impacts. Is that a fair? Okay. So, I mean, I'm going to go to the ocean acidification one because it's one that I'm currently really focused on. I think that there are some really interesting ideas about how we can counteract levels of acidification. I think that we're very early on in the stages of field testing that and really being able to appreciate or understand what solutions might work tangibly. And there's some pilot projects taking place now that, for example, are crushing rock and adding rock into the sewage outflow system to counteract the acidification. There's some questions around how do we test that? How do we feel any level of certainty over, whether or not that is going to produce the type of difference that we would hope it might make? And meanwhile, who's doing that? Is it a private company? Are they making a lot of money off of perhaps a solution that isn't really making a difference? But meanwhile, are we getting the rock opportunistically? Are we mining more rock to do that? And sort of what's the counteraction around what that solution looks like? Because there's a few bold ideas about ocean acidification, how to deal with it, just not a lot of tried and true ways to demonstrate whether that's the right way to do it. So as far as fisheries and committees and how we respond, we engage in climate adaptation workshops with DFO, for example, and at this stage it's a lot of just sharing information about what the challenges might look like and how harvesters can help identify what those changes are. So if harvesters are seeing differences in fish species, or they're being able to acknowledge, for example, the piling at the dock used to have starfish and sea anemone and nudibranchs all over it. Now it doesn't. Some of those kind of exposure pieces that harvesters can look at and say, okay, something going on here. And just that canary in the coal mine piece and bringing that information so that the science community can help verify what's going on. So I think the climate adaptation piece is still pretty young. There's probably a lot of different directions I could help answer that, but none of them are going to make you feel terrific, I don't think. And I know we're running short on time, but if you'd like to take that question up, I'm happy to further discuss after. Yeah.